Okay. Okay, it is 1 o'clock and we are about to start our workshop. I want to say that we do have a full board present. I welcome Laura, who did not have to walk over ice to get here. So we are present and correct. Votes to renew the district's educational program and operations levy and for capital bonds require study, careful preparation, and dedicated planning. Today's workshop is designed to help the district and board prepare well for this work. El asunto del taller de hoy es informarnos sobre las necesidades de estudiar, preparar con cuidado y planificar con dedicación antes de votar la renovación de nuestro impuesto para operaciones y programas educativos o aprobación de un bono de capital. For that purpose, I really want to welcome our valued guest, Trevor Carlson, who are from the public sector financial consultant, and our helper, Piper Sandler. Bill, if you want to add anything before you hand over, I'll give it to you.
Well, just welcome, Trevor, and thank you, board, for being willing to look into this early. We're going to get some information on potential timelines for bonds and how that might relate to the levy work that we have coming up in 2025. So both of those things are important to maintaining our facilities and our educational programs. So excited to hear from Trevor this afternoon.
Feels like morning. Well, wonderful. Thank you very much. For the record, my name is Trevor Carlson. I work for a firm called Piper Sandler, and we have served as the district's bond underwriter for many, many years. My goal today is to lay down some foundational knowledge to start working and getting us on the same page as far as language, finding a common language. Please feel free to stop me and ask questions. That's why I'm here. If you do think of things later on, filter them through Superintendent Eagle. Happy to have conversations, even one-on-one conversations with folks. So with that, we have a presentation. Thank you, Kim, for helping us make some hard copies so you all can take some notes, but the same presentation will be up on the screen momentarily. We did some advanced work to make sure the technology worked okay. Thank you so much for getting that up. Well, great. Thank you. Let's dive right in and start talking about some of the things that are important for bonds and levies. Election dates, for your reference, there are 4 different opportunities throughout the calendar year that school districts can access, the ballot. That would be February, April, August, and November. And as you go through the calendar, as the days of the week change by a day or two, they're basically fairly stagnant. But for your reference, those dates are there. Do note the resolution filing dates are the second column in from the left. Those are very important. Think of those as your kind of deadline milestones to start backing into the schedule as you move through time. And approximate mailing dates there. And then a couple weeks later, those election results are certified. Next slide, maybe. I hear it beeping, but not moving forward. There we go. Thank you very much. An illustrative timeline. Again, just some things to think about as you're working backwards from that milestone planning perspective. These dates are general dates and timeframes for a February 13th, 2024 election. So do note those ballots would be mailed approximately January 26th. The election resolution filing deadline with the county auditors, December 15th. And then throughout the autumn and the summertime, the facilities committee or the EP&O election committee is getting doing their work, making recommendations, and then a lot of that facilities committee or election committee work is done along with community research to make sure that what you are proposing fits with what the community needs. Election dates and passage rate. The top portion of this graphic shows K-12 bonds going back to 1992. 50% of any bond on the ballot that has been placed on the February election has passed. About a third in April, approximately a third in November, 14%, that's 1 out of 7 in August. It's a difficult time to kind of rally the troops around an educational topic in the middle of summertime. The bottom portion of this graphic shows the passage rates for school bonds by calendar year. I call it the random walk. We've tried to find correlations with things like gas prices, unemployment rate, GDP, very, very low correlation, because these are very, very community specific topics, right? Think of your bond election versus another district's bond election, right? Apples and oranges. Your needs are different than your neighbors. Going back to 2012, we've seen fairly high passage rates. Long-term average is 40%. 40% of any bond on the ballot passes. The last couple of years have been a little bit more difficult. There's a small number at the bottom of the graphic, a 0. That shows the number of attempts. There were no at-bats. No one took a swing in 2021. 2022, 21% of the bonds on the ballot passed. I've got some details, I think on the next slide, or in a couple slides that show you exactly what has happened in 2022. I anticipate those opportunities, those at-bats, those number of attempts to escalate fairly dramatically in 23 and even more so in 24. We're doing a lot of planning for school districts to be on the ballot in those timeframes. Same type of look, but for educational programs and operation levies. Passage rates on top by election, February, April, August, November. And passage rates by year on the bottom portion of that graphic. I did add in double levy failures as the red, the small number on the bottom. I've kind of broken everything I've learned in business school about what to do on a PowerPoint. I'm killing you with data, too much data on one PowerPoint. But back in 2020, there were 6 double levy failures, and there had not been any for many years prior. So it kind of got us thinking, okay, what's happening? We need to start tracking this again. 0 the following year, 3 this year. I think a couple different things are going on there. Obviously, COVID and masks and just kind of general political issues that boil down into the K-12 system, number 1. Number 2, post-McCleary. Some confusion on what McCleary did to the actual funding for operations of school districts. Again, hyper specific instances of underlying issues that created those situations. So I don't see it as a major trend going forward, but we did want to start following that as we move through time. Do recall, passage rates for bonds are 60%. Back in 2008, got a little simple majority requirement kind of graphic on the top there, 50% plus 1. So those passage rates for those EP&O levies increased dramatically post 2008 in that constitutional amendment. Capital projects levies, same type of graphic. Passage rates are relatively high. They've come down a little bit in 2022, but still a fair amount of those pass. Do keep in mind, quite a few of those levies are technology, quote unquote, levies. There is no such thing as a technology levy in the RCW. You can utilize a capital levy for many purposes, and one of them being technology. Here's the graphic I was alluding to earlier. I think that's page 6. That's a small little number over there of what's happened in 2022 in Washington State. In February, North Shore and Bellingham were successful. In April, there were 1, 2, 3 attempts. None fared in a positive light there. And then 2 passed Highline and Renton in November. November is becoming a little bit more of a popular time to go. I guess on the margins, there are certain districts. Highline has made it a point to utilize November. They feel like if they've receive a high turnout, their chances of passing are higher, and it's been working out well for them. Question I get asked often: should I place my bond and my operating levy on the ballot at the same time? So let's look at empirical evidence. I'm not going to give you, the beauty of my job is I never have the right answer. I give you the spectrum of possibilities and we find the best solution for you. But the takeaway here is we don't necessarily see it as an extreme negative based on the empirical results. So on the left-hand side, separately, EP&Os passed at 97%, or excuse me, 91.7% on the ballot by themselves. Bonds, 41.2. Remember kind of that magic 40% number for bond passage rates. The right-hand side shows the passage rates if they are put on the ballot simultaneously. Those graphics don't look materially different to me, nor do the actual numbers. Again, grain of salt. The sample size for the instances on the right are significantly lower, but we don't see wholesale problems, right? We don't see this orange bar being 0. It's not a material difference. So something to think about. Some school districts do it on purpose because they want the economies of scale of getting the message out, right? It's difficult to rally the troops around elections and getting the citizens engaged. Any questions before I move on? Okay, I see some notes taken. I love it. Okay. From a high level perspective, I like to give folks some things to kind of chew on, to think about what resonates in your community. What do you think are the messaging topics around education that would help pass a bond? Statewide voter research. This was done in 2019. Traditionally, we have done this every other year. 19 plus 2 is 21. We did not, based upon COVID, feel like we wanted to go through this exercise and basically have the biggest asterisks in the world on the data as it moved forward, because it would probably be skewed. We're going to re-engage and do this again this summer. But these messaging topics that resonate well have not changed for many, many years, if not decades. We've been doing this research back since 1992. So the question the pollster asks: would you favor or oppose a bond measure if you knew the funds would be used for X, Y, and Z? CTE has ranked at the top of that list for a long, long time. Tax rate won't increase for homeowners if the bonds are approved. That's very, very difficult, if not impossible. There are rare instances where we've been able to make and achieve that message. Highline was one of them last month, but that has been years in the making of long-term planning. But what we take away from that is tax stability is important. And one of my goals, and you'll see it in a few slides, is trying to maintain level tax rates so you can communicate that the burden for the ask will be relatively stable over time. Safety and security, I won't read the entire list to you. Why I put these on this slide, these messages, is because the pollsters love to see a 10-point cushion. If you need 60% yes vote to pass, 60 plus 10, 70, those messages should work very, very well for your community. Some of the things that do not work as well, but again, I'm throwing these out there for you to start thinking about your specific messaging topics. These aren't the answers. Make improvements to all school districts, build new schools to replace buildings that are old and need repair, athletic facilities. Rounds out the list on the bottom. Again, athletic facilities sells in some places, so that's at the top, right? Know your community. These are your election results. Okay, so file this away in case constituents ask you. You have a document you can utilize to go back and look up the history. Election results on the top portion. April of 18 was that $120 million ask at 57.08% yes. EP&O elections on the bottom. Again, congratulations in February of 21 at 63%. I love to see that because you need 60% for a bond. If you're not hitting 60% on your EP&O right here, that can make this next ask fairly heavy. Tax rates, and we'll look at more details in tax rates in a couple slides. But just to get your mind around where you've been from a millage rate or a tax rate perspective, dollars per thousand. $5 back in 2001, 501, crept up to, what's the high point there? 2005 at 5.99, almost $6. Now we're down to 292. What is a major driver? A lot of school districts had $1.50 in 2019, right? Post McCleary, that cap, levy lid, if you will. Comparable tax rates. Your neighbors in Chelan and Douglas County ranked from highest to lowest. Cashmere at 389, you at 292, Lake Chelan down at $1.15. Not really fair to compare Cashmere to Wenatchee based on the size of the assessed value. So what I've put together on the next slide are school districts that have an approximate similar assessed value. Give you a little bit more apples to apples. Sometimes we run this with districts that want to compare themselves to the sporting league or enrollment. So different ways to slice and dice this, but assessed value is a pretty strong metric to compare. This gives you, again, some relative measurement on where you land compared to others across the state. Right now, Fife is winning at 473. Okay, let's talk a little bit about bond planning and the assumptions that go into bond planning. We've talked a little bit about unlimited tax general obligation bonds, voted bonds, that new revenue stream that's created, right? Takes away the burden from the district's general fund, the operating fund. Repaid with property taxes, 60% yes vote, 40% validation. So validation means 40% of the folks that came out at the last general election need to turn out for your bond election. So you need a critical mass, right? You can't have 3 people vote yes and have it pass. Debt capacity. The graphic on the box on the upper right-hand side shows debt capacity. 5% of the district's assessed value, subtract the bonds that are on the books today, leaves about 300, round number 300 million. So an extensive amount of statutory debt capacity. That's the maximum amount you could borrow at that point in time. You can borrow without the vote of the people. We've talked about that the last time I was in front of you a few months ago. I can't remember when that was, maybe this summer. I don't know when that was. Time flies. We were talking a little bit about non-voted debt. 3/8 of 1%, the box kind of in the lower middle side on the right there, 27.260 million. And that would be, think of that as a personal loan or backed by the district's general fund. You can also fund projects with a dedicated capital levy. You only need 50% plus 1. No validation requirement. Only bonds have that validation requirement. So transportation, capital, operating, no validation requirement. And all of those are at 50% plus 1. Think of that as a pay as you can go, or pay as you go, right? You ask voters for $100 every year for 6 years. And you utilize those dollars as they come in to take care of ongoing needs, roofs, technology, anything capital related. So pros and cons, again, not giving you the right answer. The bond is like a mortgage. You can borrow a large sum of money and spread it over a long period of time to keep those tax rates and payments low. Think of that as, like a 20-year mortgage. Where if you, apples to apples, let's say that was 200 million. If you needed 200 million from a capital projects levy, you could take that 200 million and chop it into 6, increments, right? So that tax rate's going to be a lot higher. And I'll show you some real life examples of what that would look like. Okay, so again, no right or wrong answer, but for very, very large capital facilities needs, it's difficult to go that capital projects route because the tax rate's pretty high. And you're not receiving all the dollars up front. So you could have an elongated construction schedule. And then in the downside of that, we've really evidenced in the last couple of years is in a high inflationary environment, those dollars, the value of those dollars is going to diminish quickly. Questions on that? Okay. There will be a quiz later. Your outstanding bonds, the 2014 bonds, final maturity out in 2033. You have a strong credit rating with Moody's Investor Service at AA3. And we can talk some more details about that if folks are interested. Why have the call date and price there? That's really gives us the opportunity to potentially refinance the bonds that are on the books. Interest rates have moved up dramatically this year, so we do not see a refinancing opportunity available at this time. And based upon tax law, probably would not be able to execute a refinancing of those outstanding bonds until we get closer to that call date. And I won't go into the IRS tax minutia, but if interest rates are substantially lower in the early part of 2024, we'll probably be talking about refinancing the debt. But at this point, I don't anticipate that being something that's highly probable at this moment. Let's talk a little bit about some of the assumptions that go into bond planning. So what are the costs for the projects? And then where are those dollars coming from? Bonds, state match. In this environment, investment earnings are fairly significant. You can earn pretty high levels of return on short-term investments that are safe. Impact fees, timing, right? Timing is very, very important in life. I want to make sure you have dollars in the bank when you need them from a financing perspective to make sure you're meeting your construction draw schedule. And then there are tax law implications for issuing tax exempt bonds that we would need to consider after voter approval. Taxpayer impact. So what is the cost of these potential projects to the average voter? Excuse me. Tax rates are the standard means of communicating the tax impact for voters, and the assumptions that go into the planning are interest rates, bond rating, ultimately the structure and how we move principal payments around to create a level tax burden, and assessed value. Mentioned earlier, interest rates increasing dramatically. The upper right-hand graphic shows from a long-term perspective going back to 1997, an example of tax-exempt interest rates. Quite a few moments of volatility as the world has evolved over time. But as we've come out of really unprecedented fiscal and monetary stimulus, as the Federal Reserve is trying to basically normalize us post-COVID, interest rates have increased dramatically. So again, if you're looking to borrow many millions of dollars on behalf of the district's taxpayers to fund capital projects, interest rates will be a major driver. And keep your ears and eyes to the financial media. Tomorrow will be an inflation report. And then Wednesday, the Federal Reserve will be making a decision on how much to increase or decrease or no change to tax rate, or excuse me, to interest rates. We anticipate probably a 50 basis point or 0.5% move higher. Mentioned earlier, your strong credit rating with Moody's Investor Service. They did a surveillance back in September of 21 and affirmed the AA3 rating. The scale, the grading scale is on the right-hand side. So strong credit rating, anything in this AA category is looked at very, very strongly from the investor community. Some of the notes from the last credit report are there from a average resident income, full value per capita. So think of that as assessed value per person, some of the metrics that they look for. One thing that they've come to pick on, if you will, the second bullet point under the concerns, our state has a unique accounting method that's based upon RCW and law, but it doesn't comply with generally accepted accounting standards. So they kind of give us a little bit of a ding based upon that. Not much you can do on that front, but strong credit rating. Assessed value. I think on the next slide, I'll go there in just a second. I like to see the list of how assessed value has changed over time. But from a graphical perspective, you know, the kind of the run up there through the Great Reset, or prior to the Great Recession, in the real estate fueled excesses, if you will, going into 08, 09, and then a little bit of trail off as we've normalized, but then all-time highs. Up to almost 7.3 billion is our estimate for 23. I like to look at these compound annual growth rates on the right-hand side to give me some sense of, over the long haul, what's happened. 5% compound annual growth rate over a 20-year time period is a very, very strong growth rate. So through the ups and downs, going all the way back to 2002, strong growth. We're anticipating year-over-year increase of approximately 17%. Again, those are preliminary figures. The final numbers will be out probably late next month, late January, maybe early February, after the assessor kind of dots the I's and crosses the T's on all of the final data. But again, you can see some very strong increases and not really much pain in 2012, 13, and 14. Minimal decreases, much smaller than, I would say, the decreases we saw on the west side, for example. Okay, this is where the rubber meets the road. Break out your reading glasses. It's small print. It's small print up here for me to see too, so bear with me. I've thrown together some scenarios that look at capital levies and bonds. And really, this is part of our common language and building the foundation on how we move forward. Again, these are just examples. We've made a lot of different assumptions, but as we move through time and the school board decides on the action to take, if there is one, on a capital funding measure, we will update these. The marginal cost to update these scenarios is very minimal. So happy to run as many scenarios as you deem necessary. The top portion shows our calculation factors, right? All of the assumptions that are going into this projected capital levy tax rate of $100 million. Assessed value, I have in kind of this middle portion here, growing at 3% over the long term. So what I like to be is conservative, because I want to put you all in a position of promises made, promises kept, if at all possible, right? If the world blows up, the assumptions, they were, I think, decent at the time, but things change. So we try and be conservative there. What we're looking at here is $100 million capital levy and the approximate tax rates that would be generated from that capital levy. That would be a 2025 election in this example, because the levy starts in calendar 26. So when you're thinking about bonds and levies, put on your calendar year hat. Don't think about your school year, fiscal year, August 31st hat, because we're dealing with tax collections in calendar years. Okay, so $100 million, if you needed a capital levy over 6 years, it's relatively expensive, right? We're at $2. Pretty big jump. $300 million, $6. Really expensive. Okay, you can see how a large capital raise, if you will, using a capital levy becomes very expensive on the millage rate or tax rate side. but let's look at a bond for 100 million. So a capital levy for 100 million was a couple bucks, right? On the dollars per thousand. If we have those same assumptions from 3% assessed value growth rate, if I use today's interest rates plus a cushion of 1.5%, and I break that bond sale into 3 different pieces, approximately even across time. So a bond sale in 2025, 26, and 27. Again, those would be refined as the actual capital facility needs became more apparent and construction cash flow numbers were generated. We could dovetail this and make this more unique to your financing needs. Round number, $1.50. Okay, so taking that 100 million, spreading out over a long period of time creates a lower tax rate. Did the same thing for 200 million on page 25. That gets us to about $2.13. And then 300 million on page 26. And I can't read that. Is that 260? 280. Thank you. Well, pixelated for me up there. And this is all in relation to assessed value growing at 3% in these columns here. Your existing debt on the books, wrapping this proposed $300 million around the existing debt payments to create a level tax structure at 280. Okay, these are just ways for us to get our mind around, again, that foundational common language work. So as you move through time, you will see more of these as these are tweaked to be more specific to your needs. Okay, so we're making a lot of high-level assumptions right now, just for educational purposes, right? Just to get our mind around where we might be able to go. I've hit you all with a lot of data, a lot of small print, a lot of numbers. Really, I've kind of described the next steps is really modifying these types of models to meet your specific needs. Timing, dollar amount will be key. Construction cash flow expenditures to make sure that these type of models bring the dollars in to the capital projects fund in a timely manner so you can design and build efficiently. With that, I'll pause, take a deep breath, ask for questions. Laura, any questions? I'll pick on her since she's not here.
Not at the moment, thank you.
Great. Yes, go ahead.
We have a Moody's rating that is more than 3, we're on below it, 1. What's the highest?
Are you using a mic? I cannot hear the question.
I make this mistake every time and I apologize. First question, with given our present Moody's rating, the rating that's 1 lower than that would be an A1. And really in 2 parts, what's the highest rating we've ever had? And if we were to drop to an A1, maybe it's worth commenting on what might cause it. What would be the impact on our interest rate and other conditions and expenses for borrowing?
To answer the first part, off the top of my head, I believe you were a AA2 at some point, but I would have to go back and look up the history.
Okay.
But I can do that for you. The second part of your question, or the cost of a rating downgrade, they are relatively minimal because the state of Washington has a program where you can utilize the state's credit rating. Think of that as a cosigner program. The state is rated AAA by Moody's. So that would have a kind of a shock absorber type benefit to you to minimize the impact of a rating downgrade. We would be talking borrowing costs differential, higher borrowing costs differential from a rating downgrade in the hundredths of a basis point type range, maybe 0.1%. So
Okay.
relatively minor. Some of the factors that could lead you to that rating downgrade would be deterioration of the district's general fund. If there were structural imbalances of that and you were drawing that down, or material degradation of enrollment. Those are a couple key factors that the rating agencies take into consideration. And enrollment's out of your control, assessed values out of your control, but that's a positive right now as it's growing so dramatically. General fund is within your control to a large degree, but stable, sizable general fund is something that the analysts would be looking for.
Okay. And actually that state backing is a helpful thing that I'd forgotten about. And actually I'm going to bounce to a comment more than a question. You led with community specific being the biggest factor in impacting whether votes pass or not. And so you could say that we have state backing for interest protection. We don't have any backing for our reputation for responsible administration. That would be the much more serious impact of a deterioration of our fiscal position would be in the community specific part of it. And I personally think that's as important as everything else. So my next one, I want to bundle two things together, which would be tactical as you look at timing. You've given us statistical information on what happens. There's a big part of it would be, I imagine, planning your bond so that you maximize matching funds from state and others. And I don't know anything about how much that moves around and how much you can do by being clever on that. And in a similar rate, you talked about interest projection, which is a fairly scary situation right now, globally, not locally. So if you can comment on this, do. It's more of a hypothetical question. As we look ahead and try to figure out what we do, those two big pluses, if we could hit a window where we get a great match and hit a window where interest rates have dropped down and avoid a window where we wanted to do it now, but the Federal Reserve didn't control inflation and the bond rate. What's the lead time capacity you have for planning?
Let me start with answering that last part of that series of questions. Really a 24 to 12 month kind of window is ideal for the facilities committee to become assembled, to investigate what are the deficiencies and opportunities on the facility side. During that process, there will be communication with OSPI regarding the state matching program. That is a complicated formula, but if you boil it down into age of facilities, condition of facilities, and unhoused students, right? If you're bursting at the seams, get more money. If the condition of your facilities is not as great as they should be, more dollars from the state. Age of facilities, the facility can only be qualified once every 30 years. So you have to be very strategic in when you utilize those funds, because it's going to be a generation before you can tap the state to have matching dollars for that space again. So within that facilities committee, those types of discussions will happen, and there will be discovery around specifically that state matching estimate.
Okay, so basically the state match is predictive with proper homework. It's not gamesmanship and luck and watching for things changing.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. And from an interest rate perspective, we do our best to build cushion into the plan. as the plan, the inputs change and there are actuals, we'll refresh the plan, so these types of scenarios are living, breathing documents. Just because we have something at the time of the initial planning for the facilities committee, months later, things change, assessed value estimates come in, interest rates change, different dollar amounts based on the scope of work change. These become updated in real time.
Okay.
But that is a risk. That's something that the interest rate risk is significant in a rising rate environment. And we will be cognizant of that as we move forward post yes vote.
Yeah. Okay, yes, because there's a time in advance for that. That's
Right.
true. You're looking even further ahead, not at
Yeah,
the time of the
it's-
vote.
So think about
Yeah.
this type of model.
Yeah.
We're drawing a line in the sand. This is mid-December before Thanksgiving for folks that are going to be on the ballot in February. You do not lock in borrowing costs until you sell bonds. So as interest rates change, we need
Yeah.
to make sure we have enough cushion to maintain our integrity of promises made, promises kept. If the world changes dramatically, everyone's models blow up depending on their financial or educational or whatever they are, and then we rebaseline.
Okay.
It's a painful process, but think about negative assessed values. We don't plan for those. We haven't planned for those. They could happen again. We're at all-time highs. And if the Federal Reserve really clamps down and slams the brakes on things, real estate's already the first thing that's slowing down, right? Mortgage rates have gone from 3 to 6 to 7. There will be slowing there. Will it be negative? I don't know. So I guarantee you this is incorrect.
Yeah. Actually, that's very, very helpful because my mindset had been the interest rate at the time that we voted, not the interest rate at disbursement. So no matter what, you're pretending you're like a Federal Reserve person projecting.
For sure.
Yeah.
And in these, think of a $300 million an approval. You're probably not going to sell all the bonds at once. The IRS has some constraints. They want you to have a reasonable expectation to spend 85% of the money in 3 years. So that usually necessitates you have multiple projects going on. There's some constraints from the IRS. So you're going to break that into 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 bond sales, depending on the scope of work and your timeline. And each one of those discrete sales will have a different interest rate based upon the market at that point in time.
Yeah.
Great question.
No, that's great. And actually, my other question, I think, illustrates something that you can do if you get a surprise. I'm not sure I got this right, but it looked as if the 100 million bond you had on a 15-year time horizon, and then 20 years for the 200 and 25 for the 300, statutory your maximum of 40. So that, that's part of what's there, but that also becomes a tool to manage your tax burden for your taxpayers. Is that correct?
100%.
And does that have to be a firm commitment at the vote, or can that be done at disbursement?
There is a not to exceed maximum term, amortization term that is on the ballot. Folks see it when they fill in the bubble. Usually 20 years, very astute. These amortization schedules on the 100 million are relatively short. And why is because I'm trying to keep a level tax rate. If I stretch these bond payments out for a little bit longer on each of those sales, that would create more interest, and we would have a fulcrum point or a pivot point where the tax rate at some point would be higher in the near term, lower in the long term. And really what we're trying to do is wrap around $6 to $7 million of annual payments that are already on the books, right? There's a big plateau of bonds that are out there. This structure has minimal payments. You can see there's a kind of a larger payment here. Those are interest only payments. If those numbers are exactly the same, 90% of the time, those are interest only. And I've got some big principals hanging out the tail end, and those are after the existing debt is paid off.
Okay. And that matches the fact that with our two existing bonds, now that we've repaid the older one, the newer one is flipped from interest only to amortization of principal and interest.
Yes,
So we
Yeah.
actually see it in real life with what we're doing right now.
right, correct,
Okay.
correct.
All right.
So really the factor of trying to keep a level tax rate is forcing me to have shorter amortization on the smaller dollar amount.
Yeah.
And as the dollar amount became bigger and bigger, if we just kind of look at those final amortizations, they'll drop down much farther, all the way out through 2045 on that longer or the larger scenario of 300 million.
I've only got
Great
one more,
questions.
and it's not financial. It's completely different, and I may be totally out of line. I have a little drum I beat about the future of schools architecture and don't have bonds for yesterday's architecture. I was interested to read an annual school architectural journal recently, which focused on inside the building, not outside the building, how much you can do by changing the way teaching is done inside the four walls, a lot with technology. And I'm very, very interested, and I would like the facilities committee to really think about that when they get there. But it does raise another angle, and I'm just, if you've seen this in other clients but conceptually, if you're doing modifications, let's say you've got a 30-year-old school, and its walls may not be perfect, but maybe you can get more bang for the buck by changing the inside of that building than by doing a major overhaul. Then you could maybe do it more piecemeal. You could maybe use capital projects levies for it at a lower approval rate. Do you see anything out there in the school construction and improvement industry of people looking at whole structures versus technology inside the building?
No, it's very, again, community specific. So yes, really depends on what the facilities committee, what your all views are of what are the pinch points, what are the problems that you're trying to solve, right? If you're solving a problem, then you're way ahead of the game, right? We're not talking about building Taj Mahals for the sake of building Taj Mahals. What are the educational elements that you hope to achieve and improve with a capital facilities refresh of whatever the scope of work is, right? I think that's the mindset. And then with a blank sheet, blank mind, explore the spaces, listen to the educators, and figure out what, again, and kind of march through that process to find out what are the needs. Maybe the building's fine, the roof's fine, the plumbing's fine, and it's the architectural features inside that maybe need to change to create that programmatic element that is needed. I don't know what the answer is. That's for you all. That's for the facilities committee. Because these facilities are extremely expensive. Very expensive. Great questions.
Any other? Okay, I've kind of monopolized it. I think you wanted to move from that into your final recap. So I guess you have the microphone again.
I wanted to make a comment, sorry. So this is just a comment, to my colleagues on the board. We've got some important events occurring in the next 12 months, one of which is hiring of the permanent superintendent. And then the other is that we have an upcoming election, which could leave, 5 new board members in the seats. But my thought about that is that maybe on timing wise, once the new superintendent is in place is really the best time to ramp up a facilities committee, because then at least one of those elements is a known quantity. We still can't control, the election, but if the facilities committee is working for the next 12 months and whomever is in the 5 seats in a year can still benefit from the committee's work. I think the timing will work out all right on that. That's my comment.
Great. Thank you, Laura. And really just to wrap up, as you move through time, depending on what the timing is for this kickoff of the facilities committee, and maybe based upon Laura's comments, the permanent chair for one of your important employees, happy to run multiple scenarios, come back, talk to the facilities committee, educate them, again, build that foundation, common language around the things that we've talked about today. That's how I would be of service to you as we move forward. Appreciate your time.
And including Laura, if there are any final questions or comments. If not, I just want to pick up with kind of a couple of sentences of recap. Going to back what I said is that it takes study, careful preparation, and dedicated planning. And I think that links to Laura's comment, because it's true, we are in a state of organizationally with a certain amount of fluidity. I think we need to make sure that we do not compress the planning phase so that we don't get things done. I very much appreciate you being here early. I very much appreciate Superintendent Eagle bringing the issue to people's brains for us to start, and minds to start thinking about it. But I also think that Laura's point of looking ahead and making sure that we have stability in the planning, all of that needs to go in the packaging. And so this is a great start, just an awareness, and I appreciate it. Thank you very much, everybody. Bill, do you want to say anything?
Thank you, Trevor, for making the trip over, and appreciate your information and continued support in this process, and appreciate the board's time and thinking ahead on this. I think it's important that we get back on track thinking about the timing of these things.
So then, so I'm clear, so I'm clear, because we've done this, we had a similar meeting before COVID, and it seemed like we sort of had an idea for a plan we wanted to use as a start. Now what I'm hearing from this is we're really starting entirely over again. Start with a facility committee. We're not brushing off old plans necessarily. I mean, that could be one of the options, but we're not as maybe far along as I felt like we were 2 years ago before COVID hit, when we had a similar meeting. So this is a total refresh.
This is a group comment, but I'll give you my perspective. I think we began by talking to engineering and architectural consultants. I don't think we had a facilities committee in place. They began with the previous attempt at a bond. And it basically got iced by COVID. And I personally feel, and I think the body language is that that's ancient. Well, not super ancient. It's potentially useful, like you said, but this has to be a fresh start for today and tomorrow. And if anybody else wants to make a comment on that, please do. Yeah.
No, I agree. Enough time has passed, and I think we kind of have to start over. Some of the same issues will obviously remain, but there's been a mind shift, I think, towards education because of COVID and the pandemic, and that could have a huge impact on the way the facilities committee might look at a potential bond, in my thinking.
Okay. Thank you, Laura. I think that's helpful. If there's nothing else, I'll touch the gavel, and thank you very much, Trevor, for coming over. I really appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for this meeting.
Aloha.
Aloha.